have you ever thought about the question of lying? Specifically, why do people lie, or why do people tell the truth? These are age-old questions that have probably been asked for eons. Hey, everyone. Welcome to session 191 of Behavioral Observations. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Corey Stocko from the University of the Pacific, and we discuss the existing scholarship in this area. More specifically, we talk about the work that he and his colleagues have done, and we walk through a recent paper that he and his colleagues have published in Behavioral Interventions. It's called Further Evaluation of Contingencies on Lying About Homework Completion. He's also done some other studies in this area. We get into the paper and to the weeds of it, as it were. We talk about how he recruited participants, the data that they had to leave out for space considerations, what they learned from this investigation, and where they want to go next as it relates to looking into the lying/truth-telling dynamic. We also talk about how we got into ABA. We kind of got off on a sidetrack a little bit about facilitated communication. Those are in the beginning of the episode. We even talked about how Kevin Luzinski's kid earned reinforcement for peeing on the floor. You'll have to just stay tuned to figure out how that ties into this conversation. Corey closes out the show with some great advice for the newly minted. It's just a really fun episode, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I guess I should say on a housekeeping note, if I sounded more nasally than usual, your ears are indeed working correctly. I was battling a cold during the interview. Hope it wasn't too distracting for the purposes of this recording. A couple other things I want to mention before we get to the show as well is that we are brought to you by Behavior Development Solutions. That's right. BDS is back to sponsor Behavioral Observations, and I know this company well because I used their modules to prepare for the exam 20 years ago. At the end of June 2022, I'll have been a BCBA for 20 years. It's crazy. Anyway, there are lots of areas of the task list that I wasn't familiar with at the time, and the BDS modules helped me really bone up, and I felt confident going into that exam back in May of 2002. Anyway, their modules are so thorough that you'll feel confident as well. You'll be well prepared for your career too. One of the things that's important to know about BDS is that they report a 98.5% pass rate for first-time exam takers, and they have a money-back guarantee. In addition to test prep, they also have solutions for RBT aspirants. They have CE courses and live webinars, many of which are free to attend. So to learn more and to get a special offer as a Behavioral Observations listener, head over to bds.com/BOP. That's bds.com/BOP. We're also brought to you by the University of Cincinnati Online. UC Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log on when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button. Last but not least, if you need CEUs and you want to learn on the go, go to behavioralobservations.com and click the Get CEUs tab. We have BACB Continuing Ed for a whole host of topics, so if you want to learn from your podcast faves, go to behavioralobservations.com/Get CEUs. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Corey Stocko.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sicoria.
Dr. Corey Stocko, thanks for joining me on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure for sure. We've got a really interesting topic to talk about. We haven't talked about it on the podcast before, and that's lying, or perhaps the opposite of that, of truth-telling. And you've done some research in this area. Really looking forward to getting into it. But before we get into that, though, I want to learn a little bit more about you and your background. So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about how you got into behavior analysis and what made you want to pursue it as a career?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, my story is probably like a lot of other people's stories that was just sort of serendipitous. I certainly didn't grow up wanting to be a behavior analyst or anything like that. So when I went to college, I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, which is in western Wisconsin, probably most well known for the indie group Bon Iver at this point. But the other thing that's unique about that university is it actually, when I was there, had a behavior analysis emphasis and now has a behavior analysis major at the undergraduate level. And so when I was at Eau Claire, my first few years, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I really thought mostly I was going to be an artist of some kind. I was really into creative writing and music and things like that. And through some of those courses, I stumbled upon what was called literature theory. And basically in the lit theory classes, we would apply different theories to different texts, and text could be anything. It could be a picture, it could be a poem, it could be a movie, but the main idea was to sort of interpret and analyze the work of art in some way through that lens. And funny enough, the thing that I was initially drawn to was psychodynamic theory and Freud. So I spent a couple of years really digging into Freud. And over time, it kind of wore on me because it was a very academic kind of task. There was really no pragmatic impact I was making in the world. And that started to sort of bother me, that I wanted to help people, do something where I was interacting with people and helping them improve their lives a little bit more. So I was interacting a lot with a professor there named Stacy Thompson, who was in the English department. And after I kind of expressed these concerns to him, he had nudged me to take a psych class. I was about to graduate with my literature degree, and he mentioned taking a psych class. And so at the end of my 4 years, I took this intro to psychology class, or I think it was careers in psychology or something like that. And the way that I learned about behavior analysis is one of the days in that class, they played that Frontline Prisoners of Silence documentary on facilitated communication. You ever see that, Matt?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't seen it though, so I'm going to make a note of it and
it's from like 93 or something.
It's been referenced quite a bit here and there, but I'm literally writing it down right now, and I'll try to put a link of that in the show notes. Prisoners of Silence.
Yeah, so I watched it, and it took me on this kind of emotional journey, because the way that they tell the story, initially you see these kids, who have never communicated before, communicating and saying things like, "I love you, Mom," and stuff like that. And so I was somebody who was initially buying into this. I thought, oh my gosh, we're unlocking language for these kids. And then as the story unfolds, we learn what we learn, which is it's the facilitators unknowingly typing the messages. And so that documentary was used to then invite in one of the professors, who was Greg Madden, who was at Eau Claire at the time. He came in and talked to us about the behavior analysis emphasis, which again is now a major, but and he sort of basically said, if you're interested in this kind of scientific approach to understanding, you might be interested in these behavior analysis classes. And I was hooked on that idea. So I took the intro to behavior analysis class, and I was one of those people who had that experience where things just sort of clicked. I started working in the campus autism program that was supervised by Kevin Klatt, who's still at Eau Claire. And I just immediately fell in love with the more objective, scientific, pragmatic approach to helping people. And so I was really drawn to that aspect. And most of what I did is got to kind of goof around with kids and embed in teaching as I did it when I was working at the campus autism program. And I've always really loved kind of goofing around with kids, and I still do. So that's what my initial experience is, and how I got drawn to it. It was really kind of by accident. And funny enough, through kind of psychodynamic theory and Freud, I ended up studying behavior analysis.
It's kind of a interesting route. It's also interesting that I'm just reflecting as you're telling that story, particularly about that documentary, that as we're recording this in May, and I don't know if you've seen the clip of the valedictorian, I think, at Rollins College circulating, and apparently that got a lot of buzz and whatnot. And my understanding is that the that her speech was a product of a variant of facilitated communication. I think this was like rapid prompting method and whatnot. So it's just one of those things that every time I think this, FC has been vanquished, if you will, and relegated to the dustbin of harmful, fraudulent practices. It keeps recycling. It's like a zombie. It just won't. Yeah. It won't.
No, I still use it. I use that documentary in my class in my undergraduate research methods and statistics class. It's not a behavior analysis class, but to teach critical thinking, so how prone we are to subjective interpretations and subjective beliefs, and how myths, misconceptions, and pseudoscience are alive and well, and they're never going to go away. That we really have to teach people scientific curiosity and critical thinking skills to be sort of lifelong myth busters, so to speak. So,
yeah, for sure. I think too that clip that again is circulating the rounds these days too. It's so seductive because you just you want to believe the human story of this person, and you want to have empathy for the struggle that this individual had, and you still can, certainly, but at the same time, you also sound like an old crank if you say, well, that's not, you sound like a jerk if you're like, oh, well, she didn't really say that, facilitated communication, but at the same time, it's important to call it what it is too, lest these things get continually propagated. So but it really wasn't my intention to talk about FC, I suppose, but I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on some of these current events. So take us forward from there. So you probably realize at some point, hey, if I like this ABA stuff, I probably need to go to grad school, right?
So Kevin Klatt was a big proponent of encouraging me to go to grad school. And he had just kind of, named some people. We would go to conferences, the Mid-American Association for Behavior Analysis, the regional conference in that area, and ABAI. And I mean, his general advice was stalk people, see what they're doing and see what their students are doing. And so two of the people that I stalked were Greg Hanley and Rachel Thompson. And at the time, Rachel Thompson's lab was doing some research on infant caregiving, variables that influence infant caregiving responses. And they were doing it in sort of the simulated arrangement with these baby dolls and programmed cries and things like that. And I thought that was really neat. And when I dug deeper as an undergrad into the work that Rachel Thompson had done, I was really drawn to the fact that she's someone who has a lot of diversity in her history of research. She's tackled a lot of questions in different areas with different populations, and I was really curious about that and interested in developing as best I could a similar repertoire. So I went to the New England Center for Children and the master's program that at the time was through Northeastern University in Boston, and has since moved to Western New England University. And I studied predominantly with Rachel Thompson there, while working at the staff intensive unit with some of the biggest, most aggressive self-injurious cases that we saw. And I simultaneously worked in Jason Barre's lab as well. And then moved on to the PhD program at Western New England University and studied under Rachel Thompson in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Very cool. Very cool. And so now you're out in California now.
Yeah. I'm at University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. And I've been here for about I think I just finished my 6th year.
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break here and let you know that if you need CEUs, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. I know it's not the most original, I suppose, subheading, but it is descriptive. So if you want to learn from your podcast faves and on topics like functional assessment, ACT, supervision, ethics, and the like. And this also includes our Inside Java series. Head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-see-use, and you can learn on the go. All right, let's get back to this conversation with Corey.
What got you interested in looking at this as a research problem or a clinical problem? Or so let's start there. What was there a particular client, or was there a particular case? What got you going down this road of, I guess, scientific curiosity?
It's funny. I don't know if I know anymore. It's kind of a. I think I was somebody who, when I learned about behavior analysis, I was interested in all of it. I wasn't somebody who just studied kind of one sub area. So I was always really interested in reading whatever I could, and especially things that maybe were new to me or novel. And so I think I think what got me interested is sort of this being a curious person, and sort of that, I don't know, that idea that, or charge that Skinner made years ago of the science of behavior and radical behaviorism, understanding all human behavior. I'm interested in that idea. I'm curious about it. I think it's possible. I don't think that we fully demonstrated that yet, but I think it's possible that what we've learned about basic principles is applicable to all human behavior. So I think that was sort of the starting point, is just kind of generally being curious about behavior analysis in general. I didn't really have any specific clients that I encountered lying with that I can remember off the top of my head, at least. But I think it was probably sort of a confluence of factors, I guess. Maybe, like around the time I was in graduate school, I would go to different conferences, and Pat Fryman was giving talks at the time about what ultimately I think ended up being that paper that he wrote on achieving mainstream relevance with behavior analysis, the Come On In, Water's Fine paper. And addressing problems under the dome. And his, I don't know, I'm probably not the first person to say this, his talks always resonated with me. And so I think he was maybe one of the first people to really instill that idea of studying kind of everyday problems. And so I got kind of curious about that and thinking about what are some everyday problems. And in my PhD program, I think that's another thing that probably influenced my thinking. I got to take a developmental class, a behavior analysis of child development class with Rachel Thompson. And in that class, we read some old papers by like Sid Bijou and Don Baer, and then some more recent things. Hank Schlinger has a whole book on it. And I got really interested in the idea of how behavior analysis contributes to an understanding of development. And so basically, we know a fair amount from developmental research about predictions of patterns of development, the what's and when's sort of development, when kids are more likely to learn to talk, walk, read, write, etc. Right? But really, one of the main ideas behind some of those papers is that behavior analysis might have a unique contribution to an understanding of development, and that is really answering questions of why. Why do kids develop certain skills around certain ages? It's certainly not because of the age. That's an empty variable. It's likely due to environmental variables and their experiences, right? That we sort of learn those lessons at certain times, because as a society, we tend to teach certain skills at certain times in certain sequences for various reasons. So that class got me thinking, I think, a little bit more about things that could be under the dome that are very typical, common, developmentally, maybe even appropriate sort of issues. And then maybe the third thing would be my dissertation was on variables that influence the accuracy of reports of private events. It was this analog arrangement that was trying to extend Skinner's scientific interpretation of how we learn to talk about private events, how we feel and what we're thinking and things like that. And so although the study was, really a basic research question. The applied implications have a lot to do with lying. So I think it was sort of the confluence of those three factors. Pat Fryman, that developmental class with Rachel Thompson, reading Bijou, Baer, Schlinger, stuff like that. And my dissertation then also forced me to read more about variables that influence the accuracy of reports in general, which lying is something that falls under that umbrella, I think.
Hey everyone, right now I'm recording this commercial on June 16th, 2022. And it was 20 years ago, actually, and that sounds crazy just to say that out loud, when I passed the BCBA exam for the first time. I guess it's the only time, I suppose. But anyway, that's beside the point. And I used Behavior Development Solutions modules, their course prep modules, to prepare for the exam. And boy, I'm glad I did. The exam obviously was a different beast at that point in time. And the preparation of behavior analysts was way different. And as such, we didn't really have access to all the areas of the task list as graduate students. It's kind of a long story that I won't get into. But what was great about the BDS modules is that they really filled in the gaps. And I ended up going into the exam quite confidently at the time. And fortunately, I passed. And so they've continued to evolve the product, and they've continued to successfully prepare test takers for the last 20 plus years. Right now, they have a 98.5 pass rate for first-time exam takers, and they have a money-back guarantee. They also have solutions for RBT aspirants. They have CE courses. They have live webinars, many of which are free for anyone to attend. So if you want to learn more about this amazing company, go to bds.com/BOP for a special offer. Again, that's bds.com/BOP for a special offer. And that's true whether you're in exam prep mode or already certified. You'll want to check it out. All right, thanks for listening to this, and let's get back to the conversation with Corey.
Just from a conceptual standpoint, what do we know currently about the repertoire of lying and perhaps conversely truth-telling, I suppose, in terms, I suppose on the one hand, you can speculate that the reinforcers for lying are, could be straightforward in various ways. And it made me think as I was reading the paper, it's like, what reinforces the opposite of that? Like telling the truth sometimes might lead to things that the reinforcers might be longer and delay, wait longer for them, and maybe variable in nature. So it's kind of like, eating right and exercising. Yeah, it's the right thing to do. But, the reinforcers are pretty out there from a time perspective. So, So what does behavior analysis have to say on this whole kind of topic from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, I think what I would say in short is we have some things to say, but I think there's a lot more for us to think about and discover, because I think some of the things that we have to say they're sort of half-baked a little bit at this point. And so that's one of the goals of my students and myself, is to kind of really devote our lives to this area and flesh things out. But I think in terms of conceptual interpretations of lying, the first thing I would say is lying is a broad category. Lying, there's not even, there's some philosophical debates about what lying is. There's not necessarily general agreement. I mean, for example, some people consider it a lie if you withhold information.
Oh, yes, omission and commission, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and some people say, no, that's not a lie. People are, thinking about this philosophically. But so anyhow, I think lying can take a lot of variations. The main thing that we're interested in is lying about transgressions. You break some kind of rule and then lie to somebody about it, right? And so maybe I'll give an example from my own life, and I think we can kind of hang some main ideas off of that example. So I think it was when I was about 7 or 8, I want to say second or third grade. I was doing some kind of art or craft project in school. and there were scissors involved. I remember that part. And one thing to know, I guess, I was a rambunctious kid. That might be the kind way of putting it. I was one of those kids that was constantly moving and talking, and many parents wished otherwise. So the point is, I didn't get to use scissors very much at home.
I see where this is going. Okay.
So one of the, maybe, for example, to illustrate the main point is I had stitches on my face about, I think I had 4 times by the time I was 7 or something like that. So scissors were pretty restricted for me at that age. So there I was at school with these scissors. I don't remember what we were cutting, but I remember sort of thinking, I was excited and couldn't believe I was getting to use scissors. And I remember the teacher saying something like, now remember, scissors are only for cutting paper. And I thought, being, again, I think a little rambunctious, a little curious, I thought, pretty sure I could cut something else with these scissors other than paper. And when she wasn't looking, I took the front of my hair and I cut some bangs. Looked like a less glamorous Audrey Hepburn or something like that. Very stick straight, short bangs across the front of my head. And what's funny is I don't remember the teacher noticing or saying anything about it. I'm guessing the teacher probably did notice, but she probably just looked at me and thought, "Oh, there's Corey again doing something I asked him not to do," kind of thing, and figured it wasn't the battle she wanted to fight or something. But one important detail is my mom is a hairstylist, was back then, still is. So when I got home, she noticed.
Yeah,
she noticed right away. As soon as she saw me, she gasped and gave me the full name treatment. Corey Scott Stocco. What did you do to your hair? And I tried to play it cool. I said, "What?" And I kind of, reached up in my hair, feigning like, "What happened to my hair?" And kind of tapped my forehead. And I thought, oh, that. And I thought for a moment about, what story I could tell that might win, so to speak. And I told her, I was on the playground and Lisa Vita and a couple other girls, they pinned me down and they cut my hair. And she, I could tell, was not buying it. She looked at me and she said, she was on the playground with scissors? I can't believe the teachers let that happen. I got to call the principal right now and tell them that Lisa Vita was on the playground with scissors. And she did the thing where she kind of walked slowly to the phone that was hanging on the wall and looked at me like, "You sure you want to stick with this?" And before she got to the phone, I confessed to her. Okay. So that's sort of an example of the kinds of things that we're interested, lying about doing something wrong, breaking some kind of rule. And the reason why we're interested in that area is there's some research, naturalistic observations in family homes. There's at least one paper and then some other reports from parents too, that transgressions are one of the most common things that kids lie about. And probably we all kind of understand that to some degree intuitively. I'm sure you can probably think of some stories that you have from when you were a kid, or maybe kids now lying to you about things like that. And so we're really interested in that lying about transgressions. The main things that we have to say at this point, have to do with the research in the area of correspondence or correspondence training. And when I say correspondence, what researchers are interested in is the extent to which there's sort of agreement between saying and doing. And they've studied it in arrangements where they've looked at promises, saying you're going to do something, and then whether you do it or not, doing something and then reporting on a past event, and whether you report on those things accurately or not. And generally speaking, what we've learned probably won't be surprising to this audience is that saying and doing are separate operands that can be influenced by different variables. And the case of my example, the variables that influenced my hair cutting were not the same as the variables that influenced the report of hair cutting, or the lie in that case. It's sort of the I don't know. I think about like that Lizzo song, "Why Men Great Till They Gotta Be Great." It's because contingencies of reinforcement, right? Talking the talk doesn't necessarily mean walking the walk, and that's because there's different variables, environmental factors at those different points in time that influence the saying and the doing. Okay. So that's, I think, one piece of what we know so far, that there's different variables that influence those two different operants. Another piece that I think is related is in Skinner's verbal behavior. He talks about distorted tacts. He talks a little bit about lying at times, but there's not like a chapter on it or extensive amount of detail about it. And basically, if tacts are verbal responses that are controlled by nonverbal environmental stimuli and reinforced by generalized conditioned reinforcement, the idea of a distorted tact is that it's influenced by motivating operations and specific reinforcement. So it's more like a mand than a tact in terms of elementary verbal operants, if we think about it that way. And so I think, from our conceptualization, people lie in terms of reinforcement because there's some kind of characteristic reinforcement that is functioning in that context. And I think an additional piece, if we think about the story of my mom, is that there come to be, through our experiences, some conditioned motivating operations that function as aversive stimuli that I think we learn to engage in behavior that will remove those stimuli. So you think about the tone of voice that a parent might ask you a question, and you sort of know you're in trouble, right? You start getting the questions that, if you answer a certain way, it's a problem. And so I think we learn to engage in verbal responses that are maintained by the removal of those conditioned motivating operations. And so I think predominantly lying about transgressions might have a lot to do with negative reinforcement, that we lie because it produces escape from those conditioned motivating operations, all those kind of surrounding stimuli, the look, the full name treatment, the tone of voice that you're being asked in, all those kinds of things, I think, come to function as conditioned motivating operations, aversive stimuli. And I think, like the story illustrates, I didn't get away with that lie, by the way. I got in big trouble as soon as I admitted to my mom. And so I think maybe part of the problem with, I don't know if problem's the right word. I think what happens is we're sort of damned if we do, damned if we don't. If we get caught lying, we get in trouble, right? If we tell the truth, we get in trouble, because parents, I think, want to provide some kind of discipline for admitting to the transgression. I think they want to do something about the transgression. And so what do we learn? I think the lesson that we learn is it's predominantly taught to us through negative reinforcement, is lie and get better at it. Because if you get better at it, you likely avoid punishment. You escape all those conditioned motivating operations. I think that's a big part of what's going on. I think some more complex instances, like when we lie about things for the first time, a novel instance of lying probably requires a behavioral interpretation of perspective taking. Hank Schlinger has some papers on that. And remembering, Dave Palmer has some papers on that. And I think basically we learn some verbal responses that we might call perspective taking, where we make inferences about what somebody knows in a situation, right? So we I knew my mom wasn't on the playground, and she didn't see all those things happening in that context. And we might engage in some remembering. We have to kind of engage in some, Dave Palmer talks about this as marshaling supplementary stimuli. We engage in some verbal responses to sort of reason our way to an answer. So I think that those are all pieces as well. If somebody's interested in digging into the conceptual interpretations, predominantly, I think Skinner is a good starting point. I think Hank Schlinger's work on perspective taking and Dave Palmer's work on remembering are important. There's a Parsons 1989 paper that talks a little bit about lying too, but it's probably not as complete as looking at all of those sources.
I see.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It's I'm just sitting there, just sitting back and listening, taking it all in. It's fascinating from both the speaker and listener standpoint, and again, all those dynamics as you're listing off there about what information is and isn't known to either party, and the various the relative, I guess, magnitudes of outcomes for lying or getting caught or what have you. And
I think so. I mean, actually, go back to your original question of why do people tell the truth? I think it is somewhat rooted in that idea of Skinner's idea of tax. As I don't think that we're seeing elementary verbal operants when people lie. I think it's a combination of different verbal operants, little intraverbal, little tact, things like that. But I think it's the main idea of being controlled by generalized conditioned reinforcement. That's probably a big part of it. It could also be just things that parents say. It could be after you honestly report things, thanks for telling me the truth, whatever, those kinds of things could function as reinforcement. And I think, there could be some degree of how the parent responds. Sometimes, one of the things that Skinner talks about with respect to tax is they have an impact on the listener. The listener does something with that information, so to speak, and that's why it's relevant to the listener. Maybe there's some aspect of that as well, that listeners respond in ways that function as reinforcement as well. If you think about being a young kid, if you are honest about how you feel, if you feel sick, it results in maybe getting the medicine that helps you feel better. That's an example of what I mean. There's very clear ramifications of responses from listeners that can function as reinforcement if we accurately report things, if we're honestly reporting things.
I see. Wow, there's so many ways we can go with that for sure.
Yeah.
I just, as a just getting back to the lying piece, I remember, as a kid, my parents really stress, like, I think, it was that, lying was a really big deal, and they would be really upset if we as kids in the household did that, and so I'm just trying to, of course, this is all in the rearview mirror and looking way back, but I'm wondering if there's something about like the relative magnitude of punishment. Like, it's like, well, if I tell the truth, I'm going to get in trouble. If I lie about it and get caught, I'm going to get in real big trouble.
Right. Right.
I might as well just get out, just take my licks and, take the less, smaller magnitude of, aversive there.
Yeah. I think, so going back to that idea of sort of the negative reinforcement aspect of it, there's some data that suggests that interpretation might be accurate in terms of what we typically experience as children. And generally speaking, and these are from direct observation studies in developmental psychology, most, if not all kids lie. They tend to lie more throughout childhood, and they tend to get better at it in terms of kind of cover up stories and answering follow-up questions and things like that. The example when I was 7 of the Lisa Vita cutting my hair story is a good example of how kids aren't necessarily born good liars. I think we learn how to lie better, and I think it has a lot to do with negative reinforcement.
I see. So
I don't know, empirical question.
Yeah. Lots of cool conceptual and practical things to think about, and that's what makes behavior analysis so fun.
Yeah.
So speaking of cool stuff, so you did. I want to get into your study about what you did, and just for the listeners, I just had the study pulled up. It is further evaluation of contingencies on lying about homework completion. and that was recently published in what is this? Behavioral Interventions.
Yep.
Yeah, excellent.
That's right.
Yeah, and that was and that was published in 2021. So tell me a little bit about this study. What were you trying to learn in this work, and what was, I guess, the question you were trying to answer?
Sure. I think one of the first questions we were trying to answer is how to study this stuff in an experimental arrangement. There are not a lot of examples in behavior analysis. There's a fair amount of research on, from the correspondence literature, but there's some limitations about the extent to which those studies are in any way valid arrangements of lying, especially lying about transgressions. For example, a fair amount of those studies focus on kids either promising or reporting on toys that they play with during kind of a free play time. I don't know that that's really a valid arrangement of the things that parents are concerned about with respect to lying about transgressions. And a good chunk of them also don't actually report data on correspondence, or in other words, the accuracy of reports or promises. They just report on the doing. So we don't necessarily have a robust science in the literature on variables that influence lying. So that was one of our first questions, is just sort of how can we study these things? And so basically we came up with a somewhat analog arrangement where kids were given homework. It was math problems. And we gave them really hard math problems that they couldn't do because we figured those might be the conditions under which somebody might be more likely to lie, as they have to kind of commit a transgression. So we gave them math problems that were very hard, if not impossible for them to do. And we gave them the answers sort of like a back of the book situation. When you're done, check your answers, check your own work. And so what we were trying to do was arrange conditions to see if they would cheat and then lie about it. And they did. And
all right. Hey, good study.
Done. So anyhow, I mean, that was the next part was then looking at a sort of package intervention that was informed by some research in sort of applied developmental psychology. There's some neat stuff happening in developmental psychology, specifically from a woman named Victoria Talwar, who's at McGill University in Canada. And one of the things I like about her work is she like us, is very interested in direct observations of behavior, direct measures of behavior. Even if we have differences in kind of interpretations of the outcomes, it's not lost on her that we need to have direct measures of behavior, her and her students. So anyhow, there's a fair amount. If you start digging into this stuff online and look at resources for caregivers, there's this book called Nurture Shock that actually, there's a whole chapter on lying, and they really emphasize Victoria Talwar's work. One of the main suggestions that is out there is we really just need to convey messages of if you tell the truth, good things will happen. And we need to praise kids for telling the truth. And so basically we took pieces of different studies and made a sort of package intervention from those studies that we call a praise-based intervention. And basically from the Victoria Talwar work, we read the kids the George Washington, the cherry tree story that, George cuts down this cherry tree and his dad asks him about it. And he says something like, I cannot tell a lie. And his dad's happy, ends happy, and all those kinds of things. Funny side note is that story is actually not true, but we read them. That's
no small irony there, and I appreciate you walking through the nuts and bolts of that story for our international listeners who may not have acquired that little Americana footnote. So.
No problem. So we read them that story, and from our perspective, my conceptual interpretation is that there you might be teaching some rules, right? They're if-then statements. If you tell the truth, good things that happen. And then another piece we took from the research from Talwar is the way we asked them. We said something like, I want you to be honest with me. If you're honest with me, I'll be really happy. Phrases like that have shown to produce statistically significant differences between groups of kids, honestly reporting on transgressions. And then we arranged their preferred form of praise if they were honest. And so basically what we found in that study is that phase is 2 of the 3 kids, they just kept lying. It had no impact on whether they told the truth or not. There was a 3rd kid who sort of dabbled in telling the truth a little bit, but went back to lying fairly quickly. And I think one thing to highlight is in our arrangement, if kids lied about homework, accurately completing their homework, they then got to go play immediately, which we were trying to emulate kind of typical environmental arrangements we might all experience. Do your homework, you get to go play kind of thing, right? And so basically in the final phase, just because we wanted to be sure that we had the right measures and arrangement that we could change behavior, we arranged it so they had to tell the truth about cheating, about inaccurate completion of homework and things like that, to then access play either way. So that's sort of the main findings. But the thing that we really found interesting is for one participant, we had the caregiver implement the sessions. At the very end, we had the caregiver do these probes where they then basically went back to our baseline arrangement, the praise-based intervention, and then that final phase of, you might call it a tangible intervention of you got to tell the truth about cheating or incomplete homework to go play at all. And we found that those probes mapped on pretty well to our arrangement, which we were curious about. We didn't know if we had arranged this very, contrived, limited external validity kind of arrangement. And we were curious, these kids don't have any experience with the experimenter. So it's possible that we just got this kind of weird effect. And we found that that wasn't necessarily the case, that the kids still behaved the same way when we had those kind of 3 different contingencies in place with their parent. But the parent said, I don't like this reinforcing honest reports of lying thing. And that's something that now we're really starting to look at is our lab is really focused on that, getting this stuff out to caregivers, teaching caregivers to implement differential reinforcement interventions for lying that basically promote truth telling. So our questions right now that we're really focused on are to what extent can we teach those, or how do we teach those skills to parents? And then what do they prefer? Because I think right now, one of the main things that we know is, well, if you want a kid to tell you the truth, likely use some antecedent strategies, probably some rules and things like that good things will happen. I don't know if you got to read him the George Washington story, but I think those rules, and then, reinforce truth telling. But that's a tricky business because you're sometimes providing reinforcement for kids telling you about things you don't necessarily want to hear or approve of. And so we're trying to figure out how do we kind of get this out there to caregivers and what are the things that they're willing to adopt? It's one of our main questions.
Hey, everyone, this is the last commercial of the interview, and it'll be quick. Just want to let you know that the University of Cincinnati Online has designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that is 100% online and asynchronous. And that means that you can log on when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button for more. Again, that's online.uc.edu for their Masters of Education in Behavior Analysis program. All right, let's get to the rest of this conversation with Corey.
Corey, I want to get back to the difficulty of the assignments there. You noted that the work was beyond their capability.
Yeah.
I also, one of the funnier passages in the paper was that you had a camera that was hidden in a tree.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken.
That's right. We do some strange things.
Which I just cut that. I cut that sentence out by itself and texted it to a friend of mine just with no context. And
what they think?
He's like, "Where'd you get that?" It's like, I need to know more of what was going on here. But anyway, So did you review the footage, and did you see kids try to attempt the work? I mean, was it was the, I guess, subjective frustration that may or perhaps may not have been apparent? Did that play a role in this? In other words, I can imagine, I don't mean to play reviewer number 2 here with you, but I'm just like wondering if, if you gave them a lengthy assignment that was within their capability, but was just had many, many steps, like a really long division problem or something like that. It's just a pain in the butt to calculate out, but it involves just basic math, right? But within their, it just happens to be, would you get a different result, so that it's not necessarily hard, but not from a capability standpoint, but it's just a menial or it's just something that's just kind of, like I said, a pain in the butt to do, but it's within your capability. But I guess more generally with your hidden camera, you're in the tree camera. Did you see kids like gnashing their teeth over this and like looking at this and like getting frustrated with the work, Yeah.
First, I appreciate those thoughts, and I'm not sensitive about criticisms. I'm generally just curious about these questions that we have.
Yeah, and
I think we have limitations.
You noted that limitation in the paper, which is one of the reasons. So it's not. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. So I appreciate that. One of the things I would say is I'm really hoping that over time more people sort of join me on this quest or scientific approach to understanding lying and assessments of lying and interventions for lying. That was the first time we had that arrangement. And one of the main things that we wanted to do is just make sure that we got the transgressions so that we could study the influence of variables on honest or dishonest reports. And then with respect to the question about the camera, so we did that. For probably fairly obvious experimental reasons, we need to know what the kids were doing so that we could accurately record things. And we did have initially in the paper, but it got cut through the review process, some really neat data on latency that somewhat speak to what you're talking about. Oh, really?
How quickly the kids reported being done. And basically with at least one kid, initially would at least make it look like he was trying. And then over time, he just kind of went right to cheating as quickly as possible, which, makes sense in terms of reinforcement. The quicker you cheat and lie about it, it produces more immediate reinforcement in the form of access to those more preferred activities. And in this case, it's sort of leisure time on an electronic device. And so, we saw variations across the kids. There was one kid who just very quickly would cheat and say, "I'm done." Come over and tell.
You just look at the paper. It's like, oh, the hell with this. I'm just gonna.
Yeah. I mean, if you
look for the answers.
Yeah, he just quickly would cheat and just say, "I'm done." Come over and say that he got however many right, and get access to his preferred activity. So, and I think that it has to do with different learning histories. I think there's kids who have already learned about the conditions under which you can cheat and lie about it. And when they come into our experimental preparation, it might be new, but it might be like things they've experienced with caregivers before. And then there's some kids who maybe either don't have that history, or maybe they have a more nuanced history of kind of testing the waters and figuring out what's going on here with this new person. So to answer your question, we saw some individual differences, again, across kids. There was at least one kid who over time kind of initially made it look like he was giving it the old college try, and over time started just cheating and lying very quickly. And another kid who just cheated and lied very quickly.
Just went right. Tell me, I know you wrote a little bit about the recruitment process, but I'd like to hear more about that. So did you actively recruit individuals with repertoires of I guess, deception, broadly speaking? So how did you I can imagine like the flyer and like the with the little tags that you pull off, it's like looking for kids who lie, something like that. I'm just but I'm more
it's funny, this was a few years ago now, so I don't remember. I mean, what we typically do is a few things. I don't think we put flyers up with the tags, but I know what you're talking about.
I'm showing my age, but
no, it still happens. We have those on campus.
Okay, all right.
So I think we put some stuff out on social media and also just communicated with some various kind of community partners that we have. And we said we were interested in recruiting individuals who had a history of lying about homework completion, I think in particular. We never have really had a hard time getting participants in the work that we've done because I think these problems are fairly ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. So that's the best thing I remember. We've also done some work with, it kind of died during the COVID, but we've done some work where we've gone out to like after school programs because after school programs tend to care about these kinds of things and sometimes are also looking for people to come in and help with different solutions. So that was one avenue that we've taken in the past as well, where we've recruited through those after school programs to find those participants.
Got it. So I guess a few minutes ago, you mentioned some of the other things that you want to explore next. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of maybe delve into that a little bit more. So what other types of questions or variations of this that you plan on exploring moving forward?
There's a lot. I think there's a lot of work to be done here. So I could share some things that we're doing, but I'll share some thoughts on just various questions that I think I won't have time to answer before I die, but I'll work hard at it. So it's, as mentioned before, one of our main focuses right now is we've kind of moved away from trying to evoke lying because of the things that you brought up before. I mean, we agree that it's sort of funky to give somebody hard math that they can't do and arranging these very contrived settings. And so we're kind of moving away from the contrived arrangements for at least a bit and trying to get into homes and working with caregivers. So that's the main thing we're interested in right now is if we, teach basically what we know is differential reinforcement as an intervention for lying. And like anything we teach in terms of accurate tax or labels or descriptions of events, we need to reinforce those and provide some kind of error correction for the alternative or errors, right? So we're really focused on teaching those kinds of responses to caregivers, but then trying to tweak the intervention in a way that being responsive to sort of the social acceptability. So like that one parent who said, I'm cool with reinforcing honesty, but he's telling me he's cheating. I'm not comfortable just reinforcing that. She wanted to add in a reprimand. So provide reinforcement, you can go play, but I want you to know I'm really disappointed. She wanted to add in a little statement. So I got to start thinking about that. Related to that, one of my friends, Kevin Lazinski, you've had on this podcast, when we started talking about this years ago, his son was, I think, potty training. And so he was really taking some of these messages of like reinforce honesty to heart. And he told me that during potty training, it was frustrating because his son would pee on the floor, go find him, and with a smile on his face say, "Dad, I peed on the floor again." And so I think this gets at that idea of, basically in our field, the main thing that we have to say about intervention for lying right now is reinforce honesty. And so what we're starting to ask is, sure, but how? How do you do that? How do you do that in a way that parents are willing to do it? What kinds of reinforcement? Do we need to add in other components that maybe don't necessarily increase the efficacy or effectiveness of the intervention, but make it more adoptable, that parents are willing to do it, right? Sort of like, do we need to add flavor to the cough syrup so the kid will take it, so to speak? The flavor doesn't make the medicine more effective, but it makes it more likely that take the medicine. So those kinds of questions are partly what we're really interested in right now. But there's a ton of other questions. If you want me to kind of go on some other ideas, Matt?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I always like to ask people, particularly people who have programs of research, is that what are some other experimental questions that are out there? If someone's listening and they have,
for sure,
they're in grad school and they're looking for a project or something like that, or they're trying to figure out what they want to do their thesis or dissertation on. It's always fun to do some brainstorming around some of these conceptual topics and create some questions that for investigation. So it sounds like there are questions aplenty.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, but that's part of what's drawn me to this area. Is I think it's an area that there's a fair amount for us to still learn, and a place where we can make a big impact on the world and within our field. So
one observation, I guess I'll just add to that too, Corey, is that unlike say functional analysis or something like that, it seems like the sky's the limit in terms of what there is to learn about this repertoire. Not to diminish those people who are doing research in functional analysis, but there's half a century of almost of research in that area, whereas we still don't know a heck of a lot about this particular topic.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think related to what you're saying, I think that's actually one thing that could be done is functional analyses of lying. That's not really out there. It's sort of embedded into some studies that exist in terms of the baseline procedures. But what you'll see when you look closely at those studies, there really aren't a lot that look at lying about transgressions. Like I had mentioned, there's a fair amount of correspondence research, but that research kind of died off for a while and then has kind of been coming back a little bit. And a lot of those studies don't necessarily teach us about the conditions under which kids are more or less likely to lie necessarily. So I think that's one area. Maybe under the umbrella of behavioral assessment in general, there's a fair amount to learn. I think, what are lies? And we can talk about it philosophically, but there's ways of studying that empirically as well. We can look at, the extent to which various stakeholders, people who have something to say, or maybe even everyday people, label certain non-correspondence, disagreements between doing and saying as lying or not. I think there's a difference between lying and skill deficits that lead to inaccurate reports.
Oh yeah,
right.
That's a good point.
It's not the same. Just because you're inaccurately reporting something doesn't necessarily mean you're lying. There's something, going back to that perspective taking idea that Hank Schlinger talks a lot about. He doesn't talk about, you won't find much on lying in there, but I think it's related here. There's something about knowing what the correct answer is and knowing that giving an incorrect answer is likely to produce some kind of reinforcement in what that person, the listener, knows in this context, right? I think this is what in broader psychology, people will talk about intention or things like that with respect to lying, versus you could inaccurately report something because you misremembered, or you just don't even have the repertoire. You haven't even learned. Young kids have to learn to report past events, right? They don't just do it. And I think we teach it to them a lot of times through modeling. You ask kids questions, they come home from school and you say things like, what'd you do today? And you might know some things and you kind of prompt them to an answer. I think we're teaching them problem solving repertoire in that context that I think is related to remembering. But just because a kid says, I had a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch and they actually didn't, it's not necessarily lying. So what is lying? I think is a question that we could address empirically. I think related to that, what are the socially significant forms of lying? So I think some social validity work in this area as well is worthwhile. What are the kinds of lies that parents, teachers are concerned about? Related to our previous conversation about the somewhat weird things we had to do to get transgressions and lies to happen. Some measurement studies on how to arrange conditions that give us reliable, valid measures of lying about transgressions. That's a whole line of research, I think, too. And then I think under the umbrella of sort of interventions, I mentioned one already that we're really interested in is, okay, reinforce truth telling, but how? Are there ways that work better than others? Are there ways that parents find more acceptable than others? I think the thing I brought up before about perspective taking and remembering, what's the relevance of those repertoires? I think that could be an empirical question in the area of interventions as well, maybe just in terms of understanding and assessment. Another thing that we've been thinking about, and I have a student who's interested in right now, is maybe it's not always bad to lie. Maybe lying and truth telling should be conditionally discriminated operants. There might be conditions under which it's appropriate to lie, and maybe we need to explicitly teach kids those things. I think about the class. Oh, go ahead.
Was it Adele Nadowski? Didn't she do some work in that area of like teaching, like which I think she referred to them as the white lie, teaching kids on the spectrum
white lies.
White lies.
Bergstrom et al. 2016. So in that study, they taught socially appropriate lies to, I think it was an individual diagnosed with Asperger's, maybe at the time, and that's neat. So I mean, it was sort of like, if somebody's wearing an outfit and they maybe is a little funky and you don't prefer it, you still tell them it looks fine. Yeah, I think about my grandma.
Does my butt look big in this? Yeah,
I think about my grandma. I was raised by a single mom and my grandma for the most part of my childhood. And I love my grandma, but she was a terrible gift giver, like the worst gift giver you've ever encountered. She would get the category right. It'd be like, Matt wears shirts, and she'd give you a shirt, but it would not be a shirt you would want to wear. And so, I mean, for the most part, when my grandma gave me gifts, I lied about it and said, thank you. I appreciate it. Tried to make sure I wore that shirt when I saw her at times and things like that. And I don't know, there's maybe that's the right thing to do, or maybe not. There's some people who really argue that it's important to always tell the truth. I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of questions I think we could get at in our field. I think that idea of maybe lying and truth telling as conditionally discriminated operants is interesting in terms of, how do we teach that? And then also, what do people think about that? Is that an acceptable goal and outcome to focus on? I think kind of related to that, one thing, I've done some consulting with different groups that do clinical work. And one of the cases that was brought to me was a kid who exaggerated everyday activities. And one of the things we worked on, well, actually, I should give an example. It was sort of like if you asked him if he, took the trash out, he would lie about it and say he did and come up with this fairly elaborate story. And so one of the things I thought about that sort of related to that is, maybe lying's not something we should always just focus on squashing. Maybe it's this conditionally discriminated operant. And so one of the things we were trying to work on with that kid was, it seems like storytelling maybe has some potential automatic reinforcement or something intriguing to him about it. And so we were trying to teach him, telling stories, telling fish stories and things like that is fine, but do it here. Write down your stories. Tell me you're telling me a story. When I ask you about everyday activities, be honest. I need to know what's going on. That's sort of one of those examples of an idea that maybe this could be conditionally discriminated operants, because I think that idea of distorted tax or exaggerations, it's not always bad. Some people make a living. Comedians, storytellers, they take kernels of truth and they exaggerate them to make main points. And I think that that's a repertoire worth developing. I don't know that we should just squash exaggerations or truth telling. I think we need it to get under the right stimulus control.
There you go. That's a very behavior analytic point to end on.
Yeah.
So, wow, this is really fascinating, and I look forward to seeing the work that you guys continue to produce on this. Corey, I'd like to give you the last word here, and if there's any final thoughts, just in general about this topic, and or any advice you might have for the newly minted BCBA.
Yeah. I don't know if I have any final thoughts on the topic. I think I would probably just be restating some things I have already said.
Fair enough. Okay.
I think in terms of advice for the newly minted BCBA, I have to admit, I'm not probably the typical BCBA. That is, I did some clinical work, in my undergrad and in my master's program. I do a little bit here and there throughout my PhD and in my current work, but I'm not one of those people that's on the front lines. And I didn't get my BCBA and go work right away. I was in academic positions. I was teaching and doing research pretty quickly. So in some sense, what do I know? Not much, and I don't know if I have good advice in terms of clinical things, but I'll share what I think is maybe the best advice I've ever received.
Yeah, let's hear it.
My mentor, Rachel Thompson, used to always say, as long as your behavior is appropriately sensitive to X, you'll be fine. And I remember her using that in the context of teaching. As long as your behavior is appropriately sensitive to the student's behavior, you'll be fine. And sort of her point is that our behavior can oftentimes become sensitive to the wrong contingencies, right? I think about, like in the case of teaching, really a lot of what my behavior should be influenced by is the extent to which my students are learning and enjoying it. But it's very easy to potentially end up in sort of reinforcement traps that are not necessarily the appropriate sensitivity, or you're not doing the right thing, right? I think that can happen in clinical work too. I think we should be thinking about, is my behavior being sensitive to the right variables right now, or is it being influenced by something else? And, I don't know what that means to everybody. I think could vary, but I think there's some core agreements across us as behavior analysts that it relates to as well.
That's a really, really good point. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I can certainly see where that could manifest itself in a variety of settings and contexts. So, all right. Well, Corey, thanks for joining us today. And again, really appreciate you taking some time to talk about your work in this area.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And just thank you, Matt, for what you do, man. I think it's really cool that you do this podcast, and I listen frequently. I know a lot of people do, and I think it is a really useful thing in our field. Nice service to the field.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.